and to Tamas for inviting me to do this webinar. Thank you for Veshna for amazing technical support before we started this webinar, and thank you to Amina, who's going to click through the slides for me so I can really concentrate on talking and thinking about what I'm saying. Amina, can we go to the next slide now? Thank you. So today I want to talk about a report that we've written at the Early Intervention Foundation. And I'll say, before I talk about the content of the report, I'll talk a bit about what kind of organization I'm working for and what our aim was and what kind of topics we covered in the report. And then we'll go into the content. So I'm going to talk about what ACEs are. Then I'm going to address a few of the limitations that we see with the original ACEs research. And then we'll talk about a few responses that are currently being implemented in response to ACEs. And I'll also talk about a comprehensive public health approach that could be used to tackle ACEs. First of all, I'm going to talk a bit about the organization I work for. It's called the Early Intervention Foundation. We are based in the UK. We're a registered charity, and we are a research organization. So we're not a frontline service. We do research, we do a lot of evidence review. And our goal, which you will see on the next slide, our work is, our vision is that all children are able to fulfill their potential. And we do this by ensuring that effective early intervention is available and is used to improve the lives of children and young people at risk of poor outcomes. When we talk about early intervention, we mean identifying and providing effective early support for children and young people at risk of poor outcomes. And we define effective as showing evidence for improving the outcomes of children and young people. And you can learn more about EIF at the link I've inserted here, which you will have available in the slide pack as well. Now on the next slide, you can see a very brief introduction into our evidence framework. So this is one of the main things we do. We look at interventions and we assess the quality of the research that has been done around this intervention. And we assign different levels to intervention. So you can see this is from the yellow, not level 2, up to the blue, level 4 effectiveness. And this says something around the confidence we have in the research that has been done around an intervention. And on the next slide, you can see one of our main products and outputs that gives you this information. This is the EIF guidebook. You can find that on our website as well. And on the next slide, you can see what that looks like if you're online. So the guidebook is a searchable database of now over 100 interventions that we've looked at and evaluated. And you can search for interventions depending on their evidence rating, their cost, and the child outcomes you're interested in, and also depending on the age group. And another feature of the guidebook you can see on the next slide is you can search for interventions at different levels of service. So at universal, targeted selective, targeted indicated, and specialist level. I'm going to mention this later on again, but I just want to say something about the different levels briefly. So at the bottom of the pyramid, you see Amina, could you go back to, yeah, thank you. So at the bottom of the pyramid, you can see the universal interventions. And then in this slide, it's not visible that well, but you can find that in the report as well. You can find a list of interventions that can be offered at this level to people, and universal levels means that these are interventions that are available to all families. So they are in the UK, they could be, for example, offered through health visiting, through schools, or through children's centers. So people don't need to fulfill a certain criteria to do these interventions, and they are generally low cost. Then there are interventions that are targeted selective. So that means that you target families with characteristics that seem to place them at greater risk of experiencing problems, but they haven't experienced problems yet. And targeted indicated interventions is an even smaller percentage of the population of families where there are pre-identified issues or a diagnosed problem that requires more intensive support. And then there are the specialist interventions. So for example, high intensity therapy. And as you go up the pyramid, the programs generally become more expensive. But that's just as a quick intro into our guidebook and kind of our way of thinking. And what that means for ACEs, we'll look at that towards the end of the presentation. Okay, let's go to the next slide, where I'm going to talk a bit about the report, and you can see that on the slide after that. So here's just the title page of the report. This was the first author of the report is Dr. Kirsten Asmussen, and colleagues and I have helped to research and write the report. I'd like to say a bit about the background of the report. So in 2017, the Early Intervention Foundation was asked to submit evidence to the UK government about ACEs, and this was in the round with other organizations who also submitted some evidence. And there was a wide range of organizations, and they came to a consensus that there's strong and consistent evidence showing that ACEs negatively impact adult outcomes. However, there was also some skepticism around this ACEs story being too deterministic, and we'll go into more detail what that means later on. And there were concerns around risk factors associated with ACEs not being fully considered, and it's also still unclear how exactly ACEs can lead to negative adult outcomes. And on the back of that, of this hearing, we decided to do this report, and it aims at answering a few of these questions. For us as a What Works Centre, so in the UK there are What Works Centres that are funded by the government, and they are supposed to provide the public and service providers with high quality evidence around things, for example, interventions or other approaches that work and don't work. So what we did with this review was really critically look at the evidence and the methodology behind ACEs. The aims of the review were to help our stakeholders become more informed consumers of the ACE evidence base and to align what we know about adverse childhood experiences with what is known about child maltreatment and children's development from the scientific literature more broadly. We set out to answer these 6 main questions. So the strengths of evidence underpinning the conventional ACE categories, and these are the ones that you answered a poll question around in the beginning of this webinar. We also looked at how robust the methodologies underpinning the investigation of ACEs are, and whether there are other methods which might be more appropriate. I'm not going to address this in this webinar, but if you're interested, you can have a look at the report. We also looked at incidence and prevalence of ACEs in the UK. Again, I'm not going to address this today, but have a look at the report if you're interested in. We also looked at how predictive ACEs are for adult life outcomes and at possible mechanisms linking ACEs to negative adult outcomes. Again, I'm not going to address these, but they are all included in the report. We also looked at the strength of evidence underpinning interventions which aim to prevent and reduce ACEs, which, as I already pointed out, is one of our main areas of work. And especially we looked at evidence underpinning routine inquiry, which is a term in the UK for ACEs screening, and trauma-informed care. And I'm going to address these later on in the presentation because I thought that they might be interesting for US practitioners. If we go to the next slide, I just wanted to point out that it's not a systematic literature review where in the highest sense of the word, where you have a specific time frame and specific keywords you search for in the literature. It's a narrative perspective, but it is informed by our evidence, our understanding of evidence and our evidence framework. Yeah, I already mentioned we're part of the UK What Works network, and it's just important that we critically analyze the assumptions underlying the research. So we're not just replicating what has been said before, we're applying our own evidence criteria to the research. But let's get to the content now. So next we'll look at what ACEs are. And you answered a poll question around that. So let me just, so the ACEs research as under this term started with this adverse childhood experiences study, which is from 1998. And in this study, Felidy and colleagues asked adults aged 19 to over 65 in the US about experiences they had before the age of 18. And usually these things they asked about were perpetrated by parents or other adults in the household. And the study was sponsored by the US Center for Disease Control. And I think you're now doing the poll. And I just put in a few answers. Okay, I'm going to wait for a bit. So I just wanted to ask you what you think ACEs are, and I can see on my poll window that 16 of 52 have voted now. So maybe the other would like to hand in a vote as well, and I'm just going to wait for a minute for all of you to do that. Okay, I think let's go to the answers now. So most of you said that ACEs are child abuse, household dysfunction, and peer bullying. And you're kind of right in the way that peer bullying does have negative effects on adult outcomes. However, the original ACEs were just defined as child abuse and household dysfunctions. Amina, could we go to the slide that says original 10 ACEs defined as, so I think that's one behind that one. And another one. Thank you. So the original 10 ACEs were actually only defined as either abuse, so psychological, physical, or sexual abuse, or household dysfunction, spanning substance abuse in the household, mental illness, the mother being treated violently, or criminal behavior in the household. So, and this is one of the main issues we've identified with this narrative. So although there are other factors that we know have negative influences on adult outcomes, this is the original list of 10 ACEs, and it's been quite confined, and it doesn't include all important experiences people can have. And that's something to keep in mind for later, because that will come up again and again. Let's go to the next slide. Could we go to the next slide? Thank you. So one of the contributions of this original article was that it showed that having 4 or more of these 10 categories reliably predicts a variety of poor adult outcomes, such as physical health issues like heart disease, stroke, cancer, chronic bronchitis, and diabetes later on in life, but also health risk behaviors such as use of alcohol or drugs, and having a lot of sexual intercourse partners. So this was already known from the wider child protection literature. However, the study highlighted that there's this graded relationship between ACEs and these negative outcomes. So if we go to the next slide, here you can see what I mean by graded relationship. So in the left, you have the relationship between having no ACEs and having 1, 2, 3, or 4 ACEs. And then you can see the outcomes for different areas. So for example, if we look at health risk behaviors, someone who considers themselves an alcoholic, so if in the population of people who have no ACEs, that's the smallest bar. That's the comparison category. And then if you go one further to the right where you see 1 ACE, you can see that people are twice as likely to consider themselves an alcoholic. And then the red bar shows the odds ratio for 2 ACEs, and then for 3 and for 4+. And you can see people with 4 or more ACEs are more likely to consider themselves an alcoholic compared to people with no ACEs. And a similar relationship occurs for all these other outcome areas. So for other health risk behaviors, such as having many intercourse partners, for physical health outcomes, such as heart disease and cancer, and also for mental health outcomes. They are quite strong for mental health outcomes, as you can see here for suicide. So this graded relationship was confirmed in multiple consequence studies, but we still don't know how ACEs cause these negative consequences. In response to these findings, which are on the next slide, thank you, you can see that, so in terms of research, the US Center for Disease Control, who monitored the original ACEs study, now also monitors ACEs. And the World Health Organization established a global ACE research network and recommends monitoring ACEs on a population level. And multiple ACE studies have been conducted internationally. And maybe, so I would be interested in to know whether some of these studies have been conducted in the countries you're from, but maybe we can talk about that later on. In practice, ACE-related policy is currently being promoted under the European Child Maltreatment Action Plan. And 2 things, we'll look at 2 things that have been done. One is trauma-informed strategies, and the other is this routine or ACEs screening that has been implemented in the US, Canada, and the UK. But to understand, so as I said, we critically assess the evidence, and to understand our position towards these strategies, we'll look at the limitations of the original ACEs research, which is on the next slide. So if we go to the slide after that, you can see the original ACE categories on the left, and then you can see other factors that can have a negative impact on adult outcomes, and that are all not included in the original ACEs list. And this is just a very brief overview. In the report, there are more details, and there's a graph around that. And then it's also important to keep in mind on the next slide that, could we go to the next slide? Oh yeah, thank you. So that categories of child abuse usually don't occur as single events or separately from other forms of abuse. So for example, psychological abuse almost always occurs alongside other forms of abuse. And child abuse rarely occurs because of a single family issue or a set of circumstances. It's always multi-determined, which means that there are a lot of influencing factors. And in fact, this is one of the reasons that makes it so complicated to find out exact mechanisms of how ACEs lead to negative outcomes. And as you've seen on the slide before, child abuse and neglect are not the only adversities associated with trauma or adverse adult outcomes. So as a summary of the limitations of the ACEs research, on the next slide, while the current ACEs framework has highlighted the relationship between this set of adverse experiences and negative outcomes, there are other categories that are also linked to negative childhood outcomes, and these just have to be taken into account as well if you want to say something around the mechanism or the outcomes of an individual person. And we're just concerned that an emphasis on these 10 original ACEs could reduce our knowledge of ways in which other adversities also negatively impact children's development. And we think that understanding these additional adversities and their relationship to the conventional or the original 10 ACEs is essential for maximizing the effectiveness of interventions aimed at preventing and responding to ACEs. And then there's another issue with the original ACEs research, which is that it sounds quite deterministic. And I've got a picture on the next slide that's trying to illustrate that. So it's often, if you look at the research, you'll often find these categories of people with no ACEs compared to 1, 2, 3, or 4 and more ACEs. And then there's usually this, there's a very strong statistical significant relationship if you compare 0 ACEs to 4 or more ACEs. And I just wanted to point out here that although this is a significant relationship, it does not mean that someone with 4 or more of these experiences is condemned to have negative outcomes. So in this picture, you can see in a population with no ACEs, 0.3% of the population engage in intravenous drug use. And if you then, and you can see 100 people here, and a third of the first person is colored in as to show those who engage in intravenous drug use. And if you look at the population who has experienced 4 or more ACEs, 3.5% of the population engaged in intravenous drug use. So this is a significant increase in relative risk. So you go from 0.3% to 3.5%, but still you have to consider that the other 96 people in the right-hand picture are not colored out, so they're not using drugs. So this is not like if you have these experiences, and even if you have a lot of them, you're not condemned to negative outcomes. And now we'll look at current responses to ACEs, and all the things that I've just said will tie into how we look at these. So first of all, we look at ACEs screening. So in the original study, Validi pointed out that it can be difficult for medical personnel to care for adults whose problems are related to ACEs, because talking about these experiences could be too personal for the doctor-patient relationship. And he suggested that although, so at the time, screening for domestic violence was recommended in the US, but he suggested that it's actually quite rare. And he also said that counting the number of ACEs, so when participants filled out his questionnaire of these 10 original ACEs, he thought that counting the number of ACEs raises patients' awareness of ACEs, and he thought that the questionnaire is a therapeutic opportunity for patients to discuss ACEs with their healthcare providers. And this idea that the questionnaire and filling these out is cathartic is supported by a few experiments, and therefore health services in the US, Canada, and the UK started routine ACE screening with frontline services. So what is this ACE screening? That's on the next slide. So it is a universal approach, which means that it's meant to be implemented with everyone. And in the ACEs screening we're talking about, items from the original ACE questionnaire are used to ask children and adults about their ACEs, so about their experiences. And the assumption is that if someone has 4 or more ACEs, this increases the probability of negative outcomes for the individual, which is quite important to keep in mind. So it's done, as I mentioned before, because there's this anecdotal evidence of the questionnaire being therapeutic, and also because after the original ACE study, outpatient visits, so people coming to the health center where the study was done, shrank by 35%, and A&E visits shrank by 11%. In our research, we came across the US, Canada, and UK doing this screening, and it being done with frontline services, meaning in doctors' practices. So after carefully looking at the evidence, we can say that there are some studies that show that this ACEs screening is feasible and generally acceptable. However, there's an issue with some of the research where a lot of the studies that show that it's that this screening is accepted by patients, so that patients think it's all right if their doctor asks them about these experiences. A lot of this research has been done with families who don't experience a high number of ACEs. And in fact, some recent studies with more inclusive populations, so with families who have experienced these things, show that they don't feel comfortable with the questions. So this is really an issue that has to be taken into account, and also has to be taken into account when you're doing the research. In addition, we know that ACE screening could lead to positive outcomes if it's offered in combination with an effective treatment. So if people complete the questionnaire and then are referred to a service, that can be a good way of helping people. However, what we don't know on the next slide is whether the questionnaire is actually empowering and therapeutic, whether this screening improves child protection, and whether the questionnaire is good at referring children to further treatment. So the diagnostic properties of the questionnaire are still unclear. And I'll go a bit more in the issues with that because I think they are quite important. So we think, after looking at the literature and having discovered that a lot of research that shows that it's unproblematic is done with families that don't have these experiences, we think that before it's implemented more widely, a few more questions have to be answered more clearly. So the first one is whether ACEs screening tools can accurately identify vulnerable children. So some ACEs might not be predictive of negative outcomes, and other negative circumstances that do predict negative outcomes, such as poverty or peer bullying, are missing from the original list. So this is what I've mentioned before, whereas that, and what you've also shown in your poll, like you said, peer bullying is part of ACEs, and it's, in a way, it's that's a warranted position because it does predict negative outcomes, but it's not included in the questionnaire, and that could just lead to problems. So some, as a consequence, the questionnaire might not identify children who require support, and at the same time, it might identify some children as requiring support who don't actually need it, which would then, if you send them on to receive further services, would mean they get a service they don't really need. And then it's also not clear whether all families understand the questions, whether all families understand the questions in the same way. It's not clear whether the experience of these things actually leads to trauma, because there might be subjective differences, but we'll go more into that if we look at, when we look at trauma-informed care, which also involves the definition of trauma. Then we'll look at whether cutoff scores, research needs to look at whether cutoff scores can be established that indicate the need for treatment. And we also need to know how the screening compares to other methods of assessing adversity. So in the UK, many frontline workers already ask children and parents about stress factors they have, and we don't know whether this questionnaire can improve this approach. And it's also unclear how often people should be asked these questions. Additionally, on the next slide, we need guidelines for screening and child protection around this questionnaire, and it also needs to involve a more holistic perspective of the child or the person. So it just, if you just use the original questions, you're not taking personal strengths or protective factors into account, but these are important to the individual, and they will influence how the experience is just lived on a personal level. And for both practical and ethical reasons, ACEs screening only makes sense if you can offer an evidence-based treatment for those children you have identified as vulnerable. And then I would also like to say something about the individual versus population level screening. So when I've talked about ACEs screening in the last few slides, and this is all ACEs screening on an individual level. So you're asking one person, have you had these experiences? And then if they say yes to 4 or more of them, you're assuming they have a negative outcome for this individual. And this doesn't work with the questionnaire as it is at the moment if you're not taking other factors into account. And in fact, the WHO advises against ACEs screening on this level, so on the level of the person. However, on the population level, so if you want to know about all people in a certain country or in a certain area, WHO does encourage screening with the questionnaire to understand how often these experiences occur. Okay, let's look at trauma-informed care. So this is a universal approach spanning a wide range of activities. It's based on, so it was developed by SAMHSA in the US, and it's that they've defined the 3 E's and the 4 R's of trauma. And the 3 E's of trauma are events, experience, and effects. So events means there has been a traumatic or stressful event, and this is what the questionnaire asks about. So the questionnaire we just talked about asks about, have you had these traumatic or stressful events? But then in order to develop into a trauma, it also needs to be experienced as traumatic. So this is the subjective aspect. So kind of you can think of the first of the event as something that can be observed by others when they see the situation. And then there's the traumatic experience, which is more subjective and you can't see that. And then in order for trauma to be present, there also need to be adverse effects. And this mirrors the trauma classification in the DSM-5. Okay, let's look at the 4 R's of trauma approach, of the trauma-informed approach, which are on the next slide. Thank you. So the 4 R's are concerned with how an organization can deal with trauma, because this is, as you remember, this is trauma-informed care, so it's about how the whole situation, the whole organization deals with trauma. So this is about the realization, which means that behavior of people is interpreted from a trauma-informed perspective. It's about recognizing signs of trauma in others, and it's about resisting re-traumatization. So the idea that you can create organizations and services in a way that do not re-traumatize people. If we go to the next slide, the aims of trauma-informed care are to reduce the risk of re-traumatization and to empower clients. And it's used in healthcare, schools, child welfare agencies, criminal justice systems, and other frontline services for children and families. And here, again, there's a bit of an issue with the evidence. So less rigorous studies show improvements in practitioners' knowledge as well as child and family outcomes. But there was one rigorous study, so we have more confidence in the findings of this study, that showed a comprehensive trauma-informed care strategy did not make a difference, or made little difference to actual child and family outcomes. And then there's also another issue with trauma-informed care, which is on the next slide. So we don't know, so there is not a consistent definition of the approach, and it's quite, so in the table on the slide, you can see there's quite a wide range of things that have been offered under this umbrella term, and there's also not a consistent theory of change. So there's this problem with research that if you don't define what you're doing and why you're doing it and how you think you're making a difference, it becomes quite difficult to research. Okay, now as the last topic of the presentation, I want to look at how a comprehensive public health approach to ACEs could look like. This is based on our guidebook. So as I said before, one of our main work areas is this guidebook where you can find information about range of interventions. And these are mainly done for the UK. The problem with routine screening, this ACEs screening and trauma-informed care, is that the research base around that isn't as strong as for other things. So on the guidebook, we show things that have, some of them have a stronger evidence base, and you can also see how strong the evidence is. However, if you're trying to develop an approach to tackling ACEs, you have to take other factors into account and beyond evidence-based intervention. And you can see a few of those on the next slide. So you need to know about the strengths of evidence of the things you want to do, but then you also want to take cost into account in implementation. And I'm sure you know more about that than I do. You need to know how prevalent ACEs are in your population and what other risk factors you might have. So you kind of need to know what your population needs. You also need to know whether an intervention could be offered through the current services you have, and whether it's actually going to do something better than what these services are already doing. And now we're coming back to the pyramid from the beginning. As I said earlier, this pyramid shows kind of a stepwise approach where you have universal programs that are cheaper and that can be used for a wider, for more people. And then kind of the more severe the problems get, the more expensive the support also becomes. And on the next slide, you can just see, so this is split up in universal service in the first row. You can see in the UK, it's offered by health visiting, by schools and GP services. It's intended for everyone. Screening is not required, and it has small to moderate effect sizes with low cost. And then the other types of services, you can see they have stronger effect sizes, but they are also higher cost. On the next slide, it's just important to keep in mind that it's unlikely that any one activity would be sufficient for preventing and reducing ACEs at the population level, but various combinations could make a difference if they are delivered to a high standard that are informed by the need of the community you're serving. You just need to take not only the evidence into account, but also what the need is, what the organizational readiness is, and the things I've mentioned earlier. And then on the next, thank you. You'll see, so we've talked in the beginning about other things that are not included in the ACEs questionnaire, and these are all things that also contribute to negative outcomes and have to be taken into account if you're designing any kind of, if you're thinking about tackling ACEs. So community cohesion, community crime, racism and discrimination, housing quality, general access to high quality services are all issues that have to be taken into account. and also just in general poverty, unemployment, and social inequality. It's important to look at these as well and not just focus on this original list of 10 ACEs. So the slides from now on, I've included a slide with some material for you with a link to the original report that we've published, and I've also included the bibliography with all the studies that I've cited just in case you're interested. And that was it from me so far. I'm now open to discussion questions. I just hope it was somewhat helpful for you and not too far removed from everything.
Thank you, Freya, for your very interesting presentation and sharing all of this data and research with us, especially for sharing more about this ACE screening and trauma-informed care. I'm now also invited, as you, there is a chat box. If you have any kind of questions and comments for Freya, please feel free to write it there. Also, I'm really interested about this trauma-informed care. I believe there are a lot of projects and a lot of initiatives today in different countries. I know that in Croatia we have it. So it was really interesting to see that there is a research, like you said, a bit rigorous research that showed there is not so much difference or a little difference. So can you share maybe something more about it if you have information?
I don't have it, so I haven't looked at this part of the report somewhat unhelpfully. I've included the research there. I mean, this is always a bit tricky because obviously we're also limited by having English language articles available. So this is one of the restrictions we have. So it might be that you've developed something absolutely amazing and we just haven't had a chance to look at it. It just yeah, from the things we've looked at, it seemed that it didn't add a lot to the care as usual. And I mean, in a way that is a good finding, isn't it? Because it shows that maybe the care you're already providing is very good.
Yes, it is interesting because we are really working in this, like providing like awareness of different practitioners, especially health practitioners, I would say, especially in our countries regarding the trauma, and especially about social workers and teachers who have the first contact with the child. So maybe some of our educational system is, like you said, maybe it's like really aimed to the best interest of the child. Who knows? I'm really interested in this part, and thank you for sharing this with us here. It's kind of tackling our ideas, what is good and what could be better and what is already good. So we have a question from Aida. Which are the best interventions according to the research for treating children or adults with ACEs? Thank you in advance.
Yeah, Emina, could you share the next slide in the presentation?
Emina, okay.
Thank you. So in the presentation, I think you'll have it available afterwards. I've included a quick list of the evidence-based interventions at universal level, and then the next one also at targeted indicated level and at targeted indicated level and a targeted selective level. There is only one. So here on this slide and on the next few, you have a few of the interventions that have a very strong evidence base. But bear in mind, there is not the one best intervention. It's really both a science and an art, I think, to choose the right intervention for a service, because you need to take the need of your users into account, and the service needs to be able to deliver this intervention. So, for example, if you go to the next slide for targeted indicated interventions, you can see there are a few psychotherapy interventions. So, for example, multisystemic therapy or child-parent psychotherapy. These are versions of psychotherapy that need a qualified psychotherapist to provide them. So you need to have the people in place to provide that, and they need to be willing to train in these interventions, and they need to be able to deliver them. So there's really, this is a whole different topic in a way, because this is, how do you choose the right intervention for your service? How do you implement it? Is your service ready for it? And then is it actually working in the way we're doing it, if you manage to implement it? So this is where it gets tricky. And also, I have to say that we can't endorse any one intervention. So we just look at evidence for a variety of interventions, and provide this this information to you, and then you can decide what the best one is for your service.
Yes, thank you. And I'm looking also on this table, and thank you for reminding this, that there is no like special intervention for every, of course, for every situation. And I'm looking on this different education, so it's in different training for practitioners. So it's really important to say that educating constantly is very, to stress how important it is, but sometimes for the practitioner in some areas is not accessible, especially for some parts of this education is not accessible for that. So sometimes we have to do the best what we have with what we have. Yeah. And thank you, very interesting. I'm new to this subject and wondered if there is a reverse significant relationship between drug abuse and adults and ACEs. Can you deduce from drug abuse or poor health as an adult that there might be an X% chance that the person experiences ACEs? Thank you. You can open. Can you see the? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a very interesting question, and it goes into the methodology of all the studies that have been done to show the relationship between ACEs and adult outcomes. So you can't do backwards causation, and this is one of the issues with this original research. You're asking adults about their experiences as a child, and then you're concluding that this experience led to this outcome, but there might have 1,000 things happen between these two events that could also have led to drug abuse. And there are a few prospective studies. So this means that these are usually longitudinal cohort studies where you, for example, look at a population in a city or in a specific area of the country. And then you try and collect data from all children that were born in 1 or 2 years. And then you follow these children as they get older. And you ask them questions again and again, and collect outcome data. And this is a way of having a bit more information about the people you're looking at and the experiences they have and what can lead to these negative outcomes. But as you can probably guess from the description of this research project, it's very expensive to do that, and there aren't that many around. But general, for the prospective studies, the link between ACEs and an outcome isn't as strong as for these retrospective studies where you ask adults about their experiences. Yeah, and this is this is just important to keep in mind, and you can't make conclusions about individuals anyway, because people are just so complex. You can't say anything about them. And this is also an issue if you're thinking about, I have someone who has had this experience, do I need to do something about it? Well, you have to, it's a very complex process to decide. So there are, for most, if you think about the diagnostic manuals for mental disorders, before you get a therapy, you usually have to do an interview with a clinician, and they will decide based on your experiences, but also on your on the way you personally deal with these experiences, whether you need help or not, because that's just so complex to decide for an individual. Does that answer the question?
Thank you very much. She said yes. So I believe that you answered the question.
Okay.
There is from Ivana, how can you tell what are the chances for the adult to get out of the circle, and how effective is the treatment of an adult with ACEs?
So this is again on an individual level. So if you're just looking at one person, it's impossible to say how effective the treatment will be for one person. It's no, you can't say that. And the chances for getting out is, I'm afraid there isn't this one thing you can do, but there's usually, how can I say? I mean, I think we all, as humans, we all kind of get worse by the same things or by similar things, and these experiences are things that are difficult to cope with for most of us. But we get better in similar ways as well. So, so I can't say a single thing, but I think generally, if like the therapy that's offered and the services are there, are supportive. But what the chances are, I can't say. I think no.
Mm-hmm. Like you said, it's really individually. You can say statistically. Let me see, there is something else from Anessa. How to motivate these school staff to truly educate themselves in the direction of trauma-informed school teachers and be willing to respond and work in the best interest of children. How to explain to the system that such education is necessary. We have a lot of education programs that formally they complete the education, but they're not truly involved in the child protection. And when you ask them why, they are usually justified by the multitude of administrative obligations in school. And teachers are the ones who see children every day and can clearly see the changes.
Yeah, so we are developing something at the moment that's trying to point out why it's important that teachers engage in these things. So, I mean, we know, for example, from meta-analysis that if children are not well, they won't have good academic outcomes. So sometimes this is a way to motivate teachers. And then I mean, this is always an issue, isn't it? Because there's a lot of pressure on teachers already. And here, most teachers are very motivated to act in the best interest of children, but then sometimes they don't know how, or yeah, it's not clear. Sometimes they don't see it as part of their job. But then a lot of teachers, I think, are, at least here, are motivated to engage in these. Yeah, so it depends on the group you're working with. So I think if you're really concerned about motivation, then point out why it would lead to a good outcome for the child afterwards. And if it's really their administrative obligations that keep them from tackling this, then it might be necessary to tackle it at a higher level so that they actually get time to do this. I think that's what I can say about it.
Thank you, Priya. And I hope that you got an answer to your question, at least a part of the questions. I really believe it's also connected a lot with the responsibility of the whole system, but also individual responsibility, how it's connected with each other, definitely. Okay, thank you for your answer. Okay. I don't see any more questions in the chat box. I find it really useful also the whole presentation you shared, and also all the links you shared with the participants for the researchers and other things that they could read in this area. And when we upload the recordings on the YouTube, all the participants will be able to see the links and use it for their future education. Freya, do you have any kind of final words, maybe before we close the webinar?
No, I don't think so. No, thank you very much for hosting me. It's been a great experience, and thank you for your questions as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your time with us and sharing all of this really useful information. I would just like to also thank all the participants to come here with us in this early morning. I would just like to share evaluation polls, so please give us a feedback. It's always really really important for us. Like I said, the recording will be uploaded to YouTube, I believe, by the end of the day. And also, as you saw in your email, there is a possibility to have a certificate of attending this webinar. So please write on the info@childhub.org and you will receive it in a few days. There is a lot of people here, so please be patient. Thank you very much, and I wish you the best rest of the day for all of you. Thank you. Bye.